The cold wind swept across the empty platform of Spring Hill Station, carrying with it the unfamiliar scent of corn husks and machine oil. October in Nebraska was neither summer nor winter, and the land seemed suspended between seasons, just as the 5 German women felt suspended between lives. Anna Holz stepped off the train first, her boots touching American soil with a mixture of dread and disbelief. In her arms, she clutched a faded suitcase and a propaganda leaflet, now soft with creases, that painted American men as soft-bellied fools who hid behind wealth and weakness. She had memorized that image, like scripture. Round-faced men lounging in deck chairs while foreign troops did their fighting. She had seen those cartoons tacked up on the walls of schoolhouses in Hamburg, passed out in bread lines, recited by officers. But now, as she looked across the platform, she saw something entirely different. Men in overalls and work shirts were unloading sacks of feed, their movements deliberate, efficient, and impossibly strong. One of them, a tall figure with a stoic face, lifted a 50-kilo bag onto his shoulder as if it were filled with feathers. Anna's breath caught. These weren't the idle cowards she had expected. There was a steadiness to them, a kind of quiet confidence that didn't come from shouting orders, but from years of taming land and weather. One farmer, arms like carved wood, tied down crates with a practiced ease that spoke of ritual more than effort. Another wiped his hands on a rag and looked up briefly, his gaze meeting Anna's with neither friendliness nor hostility, just the neutral recognition of one human seeing another. The other women stepped down behind her. Elena, who had lost 2 sons on the Eastern Front, Margot, who still wore her Red Cross badge stitched to her coat, Ingrid, barely 20 and too thin from the camps. They were silent, watching, uncertain. The group stood in a cluster, like sheep let loose into unfamiliar pasture. No barbed wire, no guard dogs, no shouts, just the wind and the sound of crates being loaded into the back of an old farm truck. Anna's fingers tightened around the leaflet. It suddenly felt absurd, like a child's drawing. The men here had hands that told stories, scarred knuckles, dirt embedded deep into the creases, nails broken and healed. She remembered Heinrich's soft, bureaucratic hands, more used to stamping documents than lifting tools. These American farmers could have crushed him without raising their voices. Not that they would, she thought. They didn't seem the type. A woman approached them next, short, Chinese-American, with her hair tucked beneath a kerchief and sleeves rolled past her elbows. She introduced herself as Helen Murray, wife of one of the farmers. Her voice was calm, her English precise. She spoke not like someone playing host, but like someone giving orders on equal footing with her husband. That, too, was disorienting. Anna had expected passivity, deference. Instead, this woman walked with confidence, eyes level, shoulders squared. Without ceremony, their belongings were gathered into the truck bed. There were no introductions, no welcoming speeches, just gestures and short phrases. Here, lift that, follow me. It wasn't coldness, it was function. Anna climbed into the back of the truck, sitting between Ingrid and Margot, her knees pressed to the edge. She looked one last time at the platform as the engine coughed to life. The train hissed behind them, like a door closing for good. As the truck rumbled forward, past fields of dried corn and barns painted red and white, Anna felt the tremble of something she hadn't known in years. Not fear, but confusion. Everything she had believed about this country was dissolving with each passing mile. She no longer knew whether she was crossing into punishment or redemption. All she knew was that the people she had once been taught to hate were nothing like the ghosts printed on paper. They were flesh and muscle and silence, and that frightened her most of all. The Murray farm stretched across endless acres of golden fields, with tall silos rising against the sky like monuments to effort and endurance. Anna had never seen such vastness. In Germany, even the wealthier families lived close together, bounded by fences, gates, and walls. But here, the land itself seemed to breathe, open and exposed. There was nowhere to hide, and no need to. Everything was laid bare under the enormous blue sky. Her room was simple but clean. A narrow bed, a wooden dresser, and a window that looked out over a chicken coop and a row of apple trees. There were no locks on the doors, no guards, no boundaries beyond the fence line meant to keep the cows in, not people out. The quiet was the most jarring. After years of sirens, commands, and suspicion, the absence of noise felt deafening. It wasn't silence, but peace, something she hadn't experienced since before the war. Helen showed her how to feed the chickens and gather the eggs, giving instructions calmly, without condescension. Her tone was firm but never cruel, her gestures efficient. When Anna accidentally spilled a bucket of grain, she tensed, waiting for a slap or a reprimand. But Helen only sighed softly, retrieved another bucket, and said, "Let's try again." The absence of punishment felt surreal, almost like a trick. Frank rarely spoke to her directly, but his presence filled the air like gravity. Every morning she watched him from the window as he moved from task to task with unhurried precision. Whether repairing a fence or splitting wood, his motions were deliberate and strong. He was nothing like the bureaucrats in uniform who had dictated her life in Hamburg. There was no arrogance in him, only labor, and that was its own kind of authority. At mealtime, the Murrays didn't pray aloud or speak of God, but their gratitude showed in their gestures. They passed food without showiness, ate in palm, and shared glances that spoke more than words. Anna sat at a small table near the door, separate but not excluded. There was no pretense of equality, but neither was there hostility. She was not family, not even friend, but she was human in their eyes. And after everything, that felt like a miracle. Each day ended in fatigue, the kind that came not from fear, but from honest work. Her hands began to harden, her back ached, but her breaths came easier. The routine offered her structure without punishment. She began to wake before dawn, not out of obligation, but habit. The sunrises over the cornfields became markers of time, each one carrying a whisper of something she had forgotten she could feel: dignity. At night, she would sit by the small window and watch the sky fade to violet. The sound of animals settling into their stalls, of wind moving through the leaves, was strangely comforting. She began to write letters to her sister, not to complain, but to describe. She wrote about the chickens, the way Helen hummed while kneading dough, the way Frank lifted hay bales like toys. It was all foreign to her, but no longer alien. The leaflet remained in her suitcase, buried beneath her spare clothes. She no longer needed to read it to remind herself how wrong it had been. Every gesture from the Murrays contradicted the images she'd once trusted. These weren't weak men hiding behind comfort. These were strong people choosing grace over dominance, and that made their strength more unsettling than any soldier she had known. 3 weeks had passed, yet Anna still found herself bracing for things that never came. When a glass slipped from her hand and shattered on the kitchen floor, she instinctively froze. Her body remembered the sting of Heinrich's voice, the lash of his disappointment, the unspoken threat behind his silence. But Helen only looked up from her mixing bowl, nodded toward a broom, and said, "It happens." That was all. No anger, no shame, just acknowledgement and a return to the task at hand. The absence of punishment felt unfamiliar and disorienting. In Germany, mistakes had consequences, sharp, immediate, and meant to remind you of your place. Here, mistakes were part of learning. When Anna botched the milking one morning and spilled half the bucket, she couldn't meet Frank's eyes. But he simply took the pail, dumped it out, and said, "Try again tomorrow. Cows don't hold grudges." She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The silence of the farm was different from the silence of fear. It wasn't a pause before a blow, but a quiet that made room for thought. There was no shouting, no barking of orders, no forced submission. Frank moved through his day like a man in harmony with the land, speaking only when necessary. Helen's voice carried warmth, not control. For Anna, it was the first time silence felt like air rather than suffocation. She began to notice details she never had time to observe before. The way sunlight spilled across the barn floor at noon, the rhythm of boots in gravel, the satisfied grunt of cows being fed. Her muscles, once tense from expectation, slowly began to relax. The tight knot in her stomach loosened each time a chore was completed without criticism. This was not the life of a prisoner. It was the life of someone earning her place. At night, she no longer lay awake listening for threats. Instead, she fell asleep to the creak of trees and the low murmur of the wind through the fields. Her dreams shifted too. The haunted images of bombs and rubble gave way to simpler ones: folding laundry in the sun, sweeping a porch, watching a calf wobble on unsteady legs. The farm was working its way into her, not just through labor, but through rhythm. One evening, while sweeping the kitchen, Anna found herself humming, a quiet melody from her childhood she hadn't thought of in years. She stopped abruptly, startled by her own voice. But Helen looked up and smiled gently. "Pretty song," she said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Anna nodded, feeling both exposed and seen. She started writing longer letters to her sister, describing the Murrays in detail. She told of Helen's way of organizing the pantry like a general marshaling her troops, and of Frank's patience with the equipment that constantly needed repairs. These weren't the weaklings she'd been warned about. They were warriors of a different kind, fighters of earth and weather, of scarcity and time. Their strength didn't crush, it carried. The hardest part was understanding that kindness was not a trick. For so long, mercy had been used as bait before the blow. Here, it was simply given, quietly, consistently. And with each passing day, that truth frightened her more than any threat ever had. Because if this was real, then everything she had believed about enemies, about strength, about herself, had been wrong. The letter arrived without warning, its envelope plain and official-looking. Helen opened it at the kitchen table while Anna was drying dishes. Her eyes moved across the page, face unreadable, but the silence that followed was heavy and sharp. "Someone recognized your name," she said at last, folding the paper carefully. "A local family lost a son at Orsha. They think your husband might have been involved." Anna's hands stopped mid-motion. The name of that place still tasted of ash. Rumors moved faster in small towns than trains. By the following Sunday, people in church avoided eye contact. Whispers followed Anna through the aisles like smoke. The pastor's sermon was measured, cautious, filled with generalities about forgiveness, without daring to say whom it was meant for. Helen stood beside Anna, as always, but the gap between pews felt wider. Anna could feel the weight of every glance, every silence, pressing into her back like cold fingers. The townspeople's kindness, once quiet and natural, turned brittle. At the feed store, the clerk who used to smile now spoke in clipped sentences. A woman who'd once offered her extra eggs crossed the street to avoid her. It was not cruelty in words, but a slow erosion of inclusion. Frank noticed, but said nothing. His jaw tightened, his movements grew more deliberate. Yet each morning he still handed her the tools without hesitation. Anna found herself retreating inward again. The silence on the farm no longer comforted her. It felt once more like waiting, for a sentence, for exile, for someone to tell her the time had come to leave. She began packing small things late at night: a scarf, a keepsake spoon, the photograph of Heinrich she'd once considered throwing away. Her suitcase sat by the door like a shadow of old fear, quiet and constant. One afternoon, Helen found her standing alone in the barn, hands shaking over a pile of folded linens. "Don't go yet," she said softly. "Let people speak. That's all they know how to do." Anna didn't answer. Her shame was too loud. It didn't matter that she hadn't pulled a trigger, hadn't burned a house. She had believed the lies. She had married a man who wore the uniform. Frank never asked questions. But one evening, as he hammered a loose board in the shed, he looked at her and said, "People forget that silence can be a kind of violence, too." Then he went back to his work, as if he hadn't said anything at all. Those words stayed with Anna longer than any sermon. She thought of all the times she had looked away, stayed quiet, survived by obedience. Despite everything, the Murrays did not send her away. They said nothing of the letter again. But Anna began waking earlier, working later, trying to prove something she could never name. She cooked more meals, took on extra chores, mended what she didn't break. Each gesture was a small offering, a silent plea. "I am not the enemy you lost." By the end of that week, the mail brought another letter, this time a petition, unsigned but full of names. It asked the Murrays to reconsider housing a former enemy. Anna didn't need to read it to know what it said. She saw it in the tightening lines around Frank's eyes, in the way Helen folded it without a word. No verdict had been declared, but she could feel the ground shifting. She just didn't know which way it would break. The frost had deepened overnight, covering the fields in a layer of silver that crackled underfoot. Morning chores were slower now, fingers numb even beneath gloves, breath visible in soft white clouds. Anna moved through her work with mechanical focus, trying to ignore the lingering glances of neighbors, the silence that had grown heavier since the letter. She kept her suitcase packed, hidden but close, just in case Frank or Helen changed their minds. She lived each day as if it might be her last on the farm, torn between dread and gratitude. It was late afternoon when the black car arrived. Anna was collecting eggs when she heard the engine, the sharp slam of a car door, and the clipped footsteps on gravel. Through the slats of the chicken coop, she recognized the woman instantly, Sarah Whitman, the widow of a local war hero, known in town for her fierce pride and grief. Her coat was tailored and stiff, her heels too sharp for the muddy driveway. And beside her walked a small boy, bundled in wool, his cheeks flushed from cold. Anna's breath caught. The conversation began near the porch, just far enough away for Anna to hear the tone, but not the words. Sarah's voice carried, tight, deliberate, unforgiving. Helen responded evenly, calmly, but her posture was tense. Anna couldn't hear Frank at all, but his presence was visible in the way Sarah gestured, in the way the boy clung to her leg, restless and bored. Then, without warning, the child darted away from the adults, chasing a chicken that had wandered too far toward the pond. Anna saw the danger before anyone else. The surface of the water looked solid, dusted with frost, but she knew it wasn't ready to bear weight. She dropped the basket of eggs and ran, shouting the boy's name, though she had never heard it before. Her boots hit the pond's edge just as the ice cracked like a gunshot and swallowed him whole. There was no thinking, no decision, only movement. The water was a blade, cutting through her clothes, her skin, her lungs. But she had pulled drowning men from rivers before, during the collapse of Hamburg. Her body knew what to do, even as her mind screamed. She reached beneath the surface, found cloth, gripped an arm, and kicked backward with everything she had. When she emerged, gasping, she saw Helen running toward her, skirt hitched up, face pale. Together, they pulled the child to the shore. He was not breathing. His lips were blue, his chest still. Anna rolled him to his side and began pressing between his shoulder blades, the way she had once seen done in a makeshift clinic during the war. Helen knelt beside them, murmuring prayers or curses. It was hard to tell. And then, suddenly, the boy coughed, a violent sound that filled the air like music. Water poured from his mouth, and he whimpered, clinging to Anna's frozen coat. Sarah arrived seconds later, her heels forgotten, her knees hitting the mud as she reached for the boy. But he wouldn't let go of Anna. His small hands were tangled in her wet scarf, his face buried in her neck. Sarah looked at Anna with something deeper than confusion, deeper than sorrow. It was recognition. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. Later, wrapped in blankets inside the house, the boy sleeping on the sofa, Sarah stood near the kitchen window, her face unreadable. "You saved him," she said quietly, not looking at anyone in particular. "You didn't have to, but you did." Frank leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching. Helen stirred a pot of tea with shaking hands. That night, the whispers in town changed. Word of the rescue traveled faster than the petition had. People talked about the German woman who dove into an icy pond to save an American boy. They spoke of courage, not politics, of instinct, not nationality. And for the first time in weeks, Anna's suitcase didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a choice. Spring came slowly to Nebraska, as if the land needed time to thaw, not just from winter, but from everything it had endured. The snow melted in stubborn patches, revealing dark soil underneath and the early stirrings of life. Anna moved through the fields with quiet reverence, planting potatoes beside Helen, watching Frank mend fences with a boyish grin that hadn't surfaced in months. There was laughter now, cautious but real, like birdsong returning after a storm. The silence that once haunted the farm had softened into something more like peace. Weeks passed without incident, and the suitcase Anna had once kept half-packed was returned to the back of her closet. She no longer stared at it before bed, wondering when she would be told to leave. Letters from Germany still came, each one more desperate than the last. Her sister Anna spoke of bombed-out buildings, missing ration cards, and a hunger that refused to fade. But for the first time, Anna's replies were filled not with guilt, but with possibility. She wrote of the farm, of the animals, of the child she had pulled from the ice, and now taught how to collect eggs. Sarah Whitman visited again, this time without gloves, without heels, and without accusations. She brought plum preserves and a letter, folded carefully and stamped with the seal of the local immigration office. Helen read it aloud at the kitchen table, her voice breaking only once. The letter was an official recommendation for residency, signed by Frank, countersigned by Sarah, and supported by the town council. It cited courage under duress, character beyond expectation, and demonstrated loyalty to life over politics. Anna didn't cry. She simply folded the letter and placed it inside her Bible, where she used to keep the leaflet from Hamburg. That scrap of propaganda had long since been burned in the stove on a cold February morning, when the wind howled loud enough to swallow old lies. Now she kept different papers: letters from her sister, notes from Helen about seed rotation, a crayon drawing from the boy she had saved, labeled Miss Anna's Chickens. The harvest that year was good. Apples ripened in abundance, and the barn smelled of hay and contentment. Anna helped organize the local festival, baking strudel with a recipe her mother had taught her when she was 12. She and Helen mixed it with Helen's southern biscuit dough, and no one could quite decide whether the final result was American or German. It didn't matter. People lined up for seconds. And for the first time, no one asked her where she had come from, only how she had made something taste like home. One Sunday afternoon, Frank handed her a small sapling wrapped in burlap. "Thought you might want to plant something of your own," he said. She didn't answer, just knelt in the earth behind the barn and pressed the roots into the soil. The tree stood no taller than her knees, but it felt solid beneath her fingers. She whispered something in German as she patted the earth closed, a blessing, a promise, maybe just a breath of hope. As the sun dipped behind the trees, Anna stood on the porch watching Tommy chase chickens around the yard, his laughter piercing the evening air. Helen rocked slowly in her chair, knitting something too small to be for herself. Frank leaned against the post, sipping coffee from a tin mug, his eyes scanning the fields, not for threat, but out of habit. They were quiet, but it was the kind of silence filled with presence, not absence. In that moment, Anna understood that belonging was not something handed to you. It was something you earned, slowly, through the accumulation of trust and effort and grace. She had not erased her past, but she had added to it. She had chosen to root herself in a place that had every reason to reject her, and instead had made room. And that, she realized, was a kind of victory no war had ever promised.